Hey everybody, I wanted to familiarize you with SPSS, what it looks like. During our summer term particularly, we won't be able to get together and use SPSS, which is a focus of what we do in our labs during the normal semester, and of course that's especially during the pre-COVID period. But SPSS stands for the Statistics Package for the Social Sciences, and it looks a lot like Excel. You know, it's got, of course, rows and columns. But it does so much more than Excel, and in a few instances does less than Excel. But I really will be using SPSS exclusively to point out a few different things that we would otherwise be doing in lab, or that we will do in our lab equivalent for this rendering of the class. So I'll point a couple things out to you. If I want to establish a variable, and I hope you can see where my cursor is at the bottom, I'll go ahead and click on that and name a variable. In a few minutes, I'm going to create the one that talks about correlations in your chapter, this silliness about wake-up times and GPA. It's kind of a almost comic example. But let me call this variable WU time. I'm typing with one hand because I'm holding the microphone in the other. And then it gives me some defaults. It's numeric, it's a width of 8 characters, and it could be more than that. The old versions of SPSS that I used from before 2005 would only go 8. This could go up to 25, I think. 2 decimals by default. We'll talk about labels later, but you can identify numbers with labels. So for instance, if this were a gender, let's say, and I was using binary gender, 0 would be males and 1 would be females, maybe. Values, that's something else we'll talk about. We haven't talked about treating missing values. It's 8 columns wide. And I want to call it a scale. Now this is consistent with the topic in chapter 1. In other words, I want it to assume this variable is numeric and also on a ratio scale. That's what it means by default, is ratio scale. So the other variable I want to talk about is GPA, and your text calls this academic performance. Oops, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to create 2 variables. I'm trying to do this with one hand because I'm holding the microphone. Okay, looks like old Scott's having a little issue here. Let me back up. In fact, I want to delete that whole variable, and you can see, things happen. So here's GPA. Good. We'll do the same thing. I also want to make this a scale. Great. So then what I'll do, we'll talk about missing values and whatnot later. I've got 2 variables, and I'll go down and click again on data view, click it back, and you can see I've got this set aside. So what I'm going to do is go to the example in your text and enter for the first, 8 people, A through H, their wake-up time. So here's 11, 9, 9, 12, 7, 10, 10, 8. Let me double check and make sure I didn't make any typos. 11, 9, 9, 12, 7, 10, 10, 8. Good. And here are their GPAs, which they call academic performance. 2.4, 3.6, 3.2, 2.2, 3.8. Excuse me, that's awful small font. 2.2, 3.0, 3.6. And let me double check and make sure I didn't make any typos. Now you'll notice it gave me 2 decimal points by default for both variables, which I could have controlled. I could have made it 3 or 0 if I wanted to. Is that 3.0 or 3? Oh, it's 3.0. Excuse me. Good grief. I'm looking at something that has a really small font, so I think I got it right this time. So 2.4, 3.6, 3.2, 2.2, 3.8. Got it. Okay, now what can I do with this? Well, what I'd like to do, as we were speaking of, in this rather comical example, is correlate these 2. Now, these are variables that we've talked about before in the clip that are negatively related, and it's kind of, superficial and, of course, hypothetical data. But the notion is that you should be able to see a negative correlation. In other words, the later a person sleeps, the worse their grades are. So let's try that. And now, how can I do that? And by the way, during the course of the semester, we'll do all the commands. We'll just do 50 of them. And you'll feel really, really good about the basic commands in SPSS if you're not already familiar. So here goes analyze and then correlate. And one of the beautiful things about SPSS, and I'm a huge fan, I've been using SPSS since I guess 97, 98. So now, and by the way, there were competitors. There used to be something called Systat, but SPSS bought Systat, and I think it essentially doesn't exist. And there's something, a new thing on the horizon called R, but it just doesn't have much market penetration, and we do not have it, to my knowledge, at SFA anywhere. So I was about to say, a beautiful thing I like about it is that you can hover like this, analyze, correlate, and this is a bivariate. So when I'm in class, I can just lift this up here without, nobody has to remember anything. And I'll enter the two variables, wake up time, GPA, and it's going to turn out to be a negative correlation, $10. By the way, we'll call it two-tailed for the sake of a correlation. We don't have to get into this. And we'll also note that it's a Pearson correlation. Okay, so here we go. So sure enough, it's hugely negative for this hypothetical data. The Pearson R is negative 0.83 rounded, and you'll remember that the strongest negative correlation that we could possibly have is -1. So this is extremely negatively correlated, and it is statistically significant. As we'll talk about in a later chapter, conventionally, which means by widespread practice, less than 0.05 is considered to be statistically significant, and you can see this is 0.01, so for what it's worth. And there are just 8 cases. So you have a very, very strong correlation for 8 cases. Let me bounce back to the previous screen. And one thing I want to tell you is that you can always keep a breadcrumb trail, if you will, for the thing that you just did. So let's say I want to say compare means, correlate, bivariate, just hovering again to let you know where I was. And let's say I don't want to forget what I did a year from now. Let's say I was doing some complicated stuff and I don't remember exactly what I did, and I don't really want to write it down either. What you can do is when you're about to execute a command by clicking OK, instead you can click paste. And what paste does is open what they call a syntax file. And a syntax file is literally a record of the commands that you have entered to that point. It's what goes on behind the scenes, if you will, the code, as it were. And this tells me to execute a correlation between the two variables, two-tail, note the significance, and it's pairwise, which has to do with missing values, which we don't have to sweat. We didn't have any missing values. Another beautiful thing you can do, and this is even better than leaving a breadcrumb trail. And by the way, if I were leaving this breadcrumb trail, I would say File, Save As, and then save it as whatever I want to call it, so the correlation thing. But another thing I could do is I could come back to this a year from now and say, dang, I don't remember what I did. Highlight it again, click the green arrow, and it repeats the command. So, and this is something, of course, Excel wouldn't do in a million years. I can leave a trail for everything that I've done to that point, which is just a wonderful, wonderful thing, a wonderful attribute of SPSS. I couldn't be a bigger fan. And by the way, parenthetically, I'll tell you, and we'll go ahead and end this clip right here, is that every computer that has an SPSS license on it has a journal file with all of your commands on it, even if you didn't take care to create the syntax like I just did. It takes some digging to get it. I think it's called something.jnl. But if you're willing to go get that, you can see something you did 2 years ago on the same computer, or 5 years ago if you've had it that long ago to repeat your steps. Well, anyway, thanks for listening to this. They won't be this long generally, but I really wanted to do 2 things: is introduce something that we could do with SPSS, like this basic correlation, and also get into just the mechanics of SPSS, the statistical package for the social sciences.